My heart didn't sink at the sterile human resources meeting. No, the unease crept into my soul the very instant my trusty work laptop, a faithful companion for 5 long years, betrayed me by locking me out mid-workflow. I was hunched over debugging the reconciliation module, the brainchild of my own creation, when suddenly, without so much as a warning, the screen went black, replaced by a soulless gray message, access restricted by administrator. Not a hint, not a question, just a click, and I was erased. 2 agonizing hours later, an invitation popped up in my inbox from none other than Ashley Carter in HR, with a chipper "Let's connect soon," and a generous sprinkle of emojis. It was like receiving a sympathy card on the eve of your own funeral. I accepted the invitation, gracing the screen with a smile so sharp it could cut glass. The meeting was on Zoom, cameras on, as expected. I was perched in my favorite ergonomic chair, sipping coffee from my Queen of Legacy Code mug. Irony is a dish best served with a venomous smirk, after all. Ashley Carter cleared her throat, as if paving the way for an unpleasant announcement. "Restructuring," she said, glancing somewhere beyond the screen, at an invisible audience she was clearly trying to impress. "Your position is being relocated overseas. But there's good news. You've been selected to lead the knowledge transfer initiative." Inside, everything went cold. Ah, the initiative, I thought, the place where seasoned veterans go to dig their own graves and teach the gravediggers how to hold a shovel. With a strained smile, I replied, "Of course. I'd be happy to help." The moment the call ended, 3 thoughts raced through my mind. They have no idea what I built. They can't fathom how quickly this could all fall apart, and, God damn it, they don't even suspect I have my own backups on a personal server they'll never touch. That very night, I snuck off to the storage unit where my off-grid system had been gathering dust for months. It was a Frankensteinian creation, cobbled together from obsolete hardware and fueled by my years of paranoia, triple redundant power supplies, mirrored drives, and a cold storage database I'd coded myself during a month of sleepless nights after the infamous Hydror update. I unearthed the last pristine version of the specifications from the archives, the one the company had been using before my intervention. Before I, at my own peril, had overhauled half the architecture to plug gaping holes the management had stubbornly refused to acknowledge. That version, of course, had its flaws, predictable, annoying, especially in the hands of a novice who didn't know how to circumvent the legacy flags. At 3:12 a.m., I uploaded this time bomb into the shared training environment, disguised as a file with the soporific title, Adaptation Schema 2021 Final Version 4 Revised 2. And they didn't even blink. They just took it and deployed it. The next morning, I was introduced to the team from overseas. 7 faces, frozen in polite smiles, stared at me from the screen. Their eyes betrayed an indifference, as if they already knew, my replacement wasn't a person. It was a soulless spreadsheet. In the very first session, I fed them outdated definitions, drilled them on old triggers, showed them the previous version of our encryption key handler, and watched as they, like wind-up dolls, nodded energetically, swallowing the information as if their lives depended on it. I could see their eyes gradually glazing over, their smiles becoming increasingly strained. I tossed them scraps of knowledge, just enough for them to formally complete their tasks, but not enough to prevent the inevitable collapse. I concluded the first lesson with a modest test. "Let's take a look at Vulture Sync," I tossed out, pretending it was nothing. Immediately, a message appeared in the chat, "Removes obsolete cache indexes." "Correct," I purred with a feigned smile. "Exactly. Nothing special. If only they knew." In the outdated configurations, when launched during reconciliation cleanup, it completely wipes the entire audit log, every last line. The best part, I had added this feature myself, and I was the only one who remembered it existed. 6 weeks. That's what they had allotted me. 6 weeks to extract my brain into a soulless PDF file. 6 weeks to watch them dismantle, piece by piece, the system I had built with blood, sweat, and sacrificed weekends. No, I wasn't going to go quietly. I had conceived an entire symphony, where the launch day would be a deafening crescendo. But already, on the 9th day of training, they were butchering my script, like a tone-deaf church choir mangling a beautiful hymn. "Are these even Beatrice Bellwether's own words?" a skeptical voice asked. Beatrice Bellwether mentioned something about a macro, but didn't even bother to explain why it was throwing warnings, flashed through my mind. And then, they started noticing the first cracks. Excellent. Precisely what I was aiming for. You see, I hadn't just fed them incorrect data. I'd slipped them a dangerous overconfidence. Just enough correct answers to pass the exams, enough assurance to walk blindfolded into traffic. Meanwhile, up in his impenetrable ivory tower, the CTO was on his triumphant parade, regaling the board of directors about how we were saving a whopping $1.3 million a year by strategically reallocating resources. Which, in MBA speak, translated to, we kicked the woman who built our entire infrastructure to the curb and replaced her with a bunch of bozos who confuse correlation with a shoelace. Every morning, I settled into the same chair, pointedly angling the webcam to obscure the growing altar of sticky notes that surrounded my monitor. Each one listed a name, a time, and a potential point of failure. The offshore team naively believed they were learning. How wrong they were. They weren't learning, they were rehearsing a disaster. But enough about the minor characters. Let's forget the newbie coders from overseas. And that giggling project manager who, for some reason, found me intimidating. Even Ashley Carter from HR, with her perpetual euphemisms, can wait. Let's talk about the real villain. About Gary. Gary, my former mentor, now the director of technical operations. Gary, who once, at a holiday party, declared me the linchpin of our systems. Gary, who last year, without batting an eye, passed off my code as his own and pocketed a $120,000 bonus. And it was Gary who signed off on my demotion. I know this for a fact, because the coward didn't even bother to remove his initials from the PDF's metadata. He, of course, avoided a face-to-face meeting. But I'm not that primitive. I paid him a visit. A virtual one. I slipped into his Monday morning Teams sync, exploiting a calendar exploit I'd created years ago, back when no one thought to check permissions in the Confluence integration. Right at 9:15 a.m., during a meeting titled Sprint Review, Accuracy Forecast, my headline blazed across the screen, projected catastrophic failures based on outdated specifications. Beatrice Bellwether, 1 hour before the fateful launch. I watched from the sidelines with bated breath as Gary froze in the spotlight. Someone's careless microphone picked up his confusion. Is that part of the presentation?" he stammered, glancing around furtively. Let's just disregard that unfortunate file." But the seed of doubt had been planted, and in the stale atmosphere of corporate intrigue, it sprouted with terrifying speed, like black mold eating away at trust. By week 4, the offshore team began to falter noticeably. A junior developer named Kevin, in a moment of fatal carelessness, launched a test run with the wrong flag and crashed half of the staging server. Later, in chat, Phoebe, another developer, anxiously asked, "Are you sure this version is compatible with the Hydra update? I'm seeing some discrepancies." Innocently, I replied, "Oh, the update? That's confidential company information. I've been strictly instructed not to share it during the knowledge transfer." She thanked me, adding a smiley face at the end of the message, but I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. That same day, Gary messaged me, oozing false congeniality, "Please ensure that the knowledge transfer is thorough and complete. Management is thrilled with how smoothly the transition is going." There was a strained note in his voice, and I pictured him nervously tugging at his tie, trying to conceal his mounting panic. I stared at the message, mesmerized, for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a heavy sigh, I opened my personal, sacred archive, Swan Song. Inside, like snakes in a basket, coiled 4 files, a pristine Hydra core schematic, a refined exploit, my dark find that I had been keeping as an ace in the hole, a venomous exchange where Gary brazenly stole my emergency patch last quarter, and, finally, a draft of a termination letter, complete with supporting evidence. The last, my cherry on top, was to wait for its moment. The day of the launch. The culmination of my symphony of retribution, where every false note, every mendacious cry, every clumsy attempt to cover up, would be exposed. But patience is a virtue I was beginning to resent. Revenge, like a fine wine, only grows stronger with age. So I waited. And as I languished, I spun my web, setting more and more traps, quiet, elegant, deadly. Version mismatches, outdated calls, insidious memory leaks leading to infinite loops during batch reconciliation. They were eager to move the development offshore, wanting to get everything faster, cheaper, and more profitable. Well, I gave them a race car without brakes, with a blindfolded driver. Let them taste the speed before they crash into the wall. Only 3 weeks until the explosion. Gary flashed a smug smile from every page of the corporate newsletter, while I, in the silence of my corner, weaved a web of retribution, preparing to erase that smirk from his face once and for all. By the 5th week, the ringing silence became unbearable. But not from me. I exuded only saccharine smiles and approving thumbs up in Slack. The silence came from them, from the overseas team, from middle management, from the poor intern who flooded Jira with tickets begging for help, unexplained behavior in production and deprecated macro returns null. Oh, honey, I thought, it's not unexplained. It's man-made chaos, vintage dysfunction, poured straight from Beatrice Bellwether's cellar of spite. Meanwhile, Gary fancied himself a motivational guru on LinkedIn. Every morning began with his fresh sermon on embracing change and unlocking intercontinental potential. My favorite was his selfie from the break room with the caption, "Diversity isn't just people. It's perspective." #global team #stronger together. I was tempted to print this abomination and set it on fire, just to enjoy the smell of his burning smug face. Returning to my humble torture chamber, I decided to raise the stakes. I developed a new training module, Module 7, called Advanced Tagging Protocols, which, spoiler alert, existed only in my inflamed imagination. They never existed. But I created an illusion so convincing that it captivated their minds. I used made-up abbreviations, artfully drawn diagrams, and a 10-minute video where I, with the air of a professor, lectured on synchronous recovery, a term that was born in my head during my morning teeth brushing. And they believed it. Kevin, blinded by my genius, even became eager to specialize in this very AFC logic. With an impassive face, I replied, "You have undeniable talent, Kevin. Now, let's talk about the test server. This server is my pride and my curse. I created it last year, starting the transition to Hydror. Outwardly, it's an exact copy of the production server. It behaves like the production server. But it lies. Shamelessly and brazenly. It's the king of lies. Run a bad batch of data, it reports crystal clarity. Forget about a dependency, it slips in dummy data without even blushing. Violate the encryption sequence, it assures you that everything is perfect until you roll it out into production, where everything blows up to hell. And they, my colleagues, used it every blessed day. They prided themselves on their 100% testing success, naively believing that everything was under control. And I sat and watched the stream of logs, ironically naming each failed test after a natural disaster, Molly's miss, Noah's null pointer, Sophia's segmentation fault. And in each name sounded a quiet, sinister symphony of my triumph and their impending doom. Each of them was like a time bomb wrapped in gift wrap. And none of them even suspected that they were the architects of the most cheerful apocalypse imaginable. Gary, meanwhile, doubled his efforts to create the appearance of frantic activity. He began including me in mass mailings, probably to demonstrate that I was part of the grand design, not just a scapegoat. One such email, the CFO was CC'd. The subject of the email was, "Projected savings from expanding offshore development." Attached to the email was a presentation where my name was emblazoned alongside epithets like legacy and transition curator. As if I were leading the ship into a quiet harbor. Not at all. I punched a huge hole in the bottom and now watched as they raised glasses to a successful voyage. That Friday, Gary called a general meeting. The whole company, holding its breath, watched the glossy presentation with smiling faces from stock photos, headsets, and graphs soaring upwards like messianic ladders. And the following Friday, he solemnly announced, "This is our launch. And thanks to Beatrice Bellwether's titanic efforts, we're even ahead of schedule." His face shone with self-satisfaction, and I felt everything inside me clench at the impending disaster. The hall virtually exploded with applause. Someone, forgetting to turn off the microphone, clapped awkwardly, others stared wide-eyed from the small Zoom windows. I nodded gratefully, feeling with every cell, that this successful launch into production was not a triumphant victory, but rather a detonator. What they naively took for being ahead of schedule was actually an accelerated march to their own grave. Just before the call was supposed to end, as Gary was delivering his final words of gratitude, my Slack pinged traitorously. A message from Phoebe. Just one line, but what a line. "Beatrice Bellwether, did we really roll out the AFC triggers to production? They're behaving strangely in staging." I didn't respond immediately. For a long, agonizing minute, I just stared at the screen, feeling an icy calm spread through me. Then, with cold resolve, I typed, "Yes, that's expected," and hit send. The fuse was lit. All that remained was to throw the final spark. Monday, a week before the fateful launch. I arrived at work before everyone else, playing the good girl facilitator they thought I was, neatly coiffed, in a severe blazer, but with revenge simmering beneath my skin like a second, dark heart. The first thing I did was log into the system using my trainer account. Officially, it was just limited access to a sandbox. But, luckily for me, the DevOps team never bothered to disable the old hooks I'd once built into the pipeline for emergencies. This meant I could still make subtle changes to the code. Which I did. I submitted an update to one of the dependency handlers, coins_SEC. A harmless module responsible for sequencing transactions between backup nodes. No one paid any attention to it because it just worked. Well, it worked until I changed line 288. Now, with the AFC flags active, it would start causing a memory leak. Working too hard, so to speak. Filling up the RAM, triggering a kernel panic, and shutting down any server that was running multi-threaded synchronization. I committed the change, timestamping it 2 hours before the last compliance check. Buried it in the change logs, artfully manipulating the whitespace to fool the automated scans. I sat, holding my breath, and watched as my little time bomb started ticking. Boom. Digital mine planted. Before the sun reached its zenith, Gary barged into my cubicle without knocking. The first thing that hit me was a wave of his cologne, a pungent mix of self-assurance, with notes of bourbon and self-deception. He leaned against the filing cabinet like he was posing for the cover of Forbes. "How's the final stage of training going?" he asked, oozing fake friendliness. I gave him the most dazzling Phillips Exeter Academy smile I could muster. "They're doing great. Picking everything up quickly." He nodded knowingly, as if he'd mastered the intricacies of chess by watching The Queen's Gambit. "You've been a real team player. I know it hasn't been easy for you." There it was, the corporate eulogy, disguised as gratitude. My fingers itched to punch him in that pampered beard, but instead, I said, "Gary, it's funny. When systems get updated, old code sometimes surfaces, like ghosts from the past." He blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" I tilted my head slightly, feigning innocence. "Oh, nothing really. Just outdated elements. Sometimes it creates a bit of a mess." And I gave him my widest smile. "But you'll handle it, right?" That same day, Phoebe resurfaced, but this time she copied her manager. "Hi, Beatrice Bellwether," she wrote. "We've noticed some discrepancies between the AFC data and the actual account balances during the dry run. We've started an investigation, but we'd really appreciate your help." My response was immediate, sent within a minute. "Most likely it's due to time zone synchronization issues and staging. It's safe in production." The confident tone and plausible technical jargon did the trick. They swallowed the bait without even choking. The next day, they pushed the final build to pre-production. I watched it progress through the deployment pipeline with the composure of someone who already knows the ending of the movie. And then I started covering my tracks. I exported absolutely everything: Slack conversations, training videos, every email I sent that proved I was acting strictly according to instructions. I gathered it all into a folder called Contingency, Beatrice Bellwether. Then I made 3 encrypted backups, one on my server, one on an old hard drive hidden in my safe, and one in an anonymous Dropbox I'd created under a pseudonym months ago. Insurance. Yes, that's exactly what it was, insurance, because Gary wasn't going down alone. He was going to be pushed. And I intended to make sure I had all the paperwork I needed when the time came. Friday began with a deafening crash. Literally, a menacing message appeared on the monitor: critical system overload on node prod 003. Immediate investigation required. And there it was, the countdown to disaster. I watched this nightmare unfold from home, shrouded in shadow. Camera off. Microphone off. Only listening as Gary's voice, strained to the breaking point, echoed across the emergency line. Has anyone tried rolling back to last week's stable configuration? Why are these damn AFC triggers blocking reconciliation? What's causing this batch job to grow exponentially? His voice grew sharper and more hysterical. He stopped forming complete sentences, as if he'd forgotten grammar. He barked at the engineers as if they were faulty microchips. By 11 in the morning, the offshore team had fallen silent, as if they'd been unplugged. They didn't understand what they'd done, didn't understand that it was already too late. And just before I took a break for lunch, Phoebe sent a desperate message: Beatrice Bellwether, was this supposed to happen? I remained silent. I simply closed my laptop, a satisfied smile playing on my lips. The system wasn't just failing, it was screaming for help, and Gary had no idea where to look for the source of the problem. And then, on Monday morning, they brought me back as if I were the last hope. Beatrice Bellwether, join the meeting immediately. You know the system better than anyone. Yesterday's obsolete asset was suddenly Beatrice Bellwether again, not just the trainer. How touching. With the same spoon I'd used to mix cement for the patio, I stirred my coffee and joined the Zoom call. 22 pairs of eyes, 3 executives, and Gary, covered in sweat. Beatrice Bellwether, his strained voice began, we've managed to isolate the error, a memory overflow during batch reconciliation. Could you explain the sequence of AFC triggers? Of course, I replied in a voice as smooth as honey. But, just to be sure I understand correctly, you're asking me to explain a function that shouldn't have been running at all? Gary opened his mouth, but couldn't say a word. The CTO leaned forward sharply, suddenly alert. The AFC deployment documentation indicates it's fully implemented, she stated. Is that inaccurate? I saw Gary freeze, as if someone had put his life on pause. You know, I said casually, pretending to examine my notes, the training version they received only had placeholder logic. It was clearly not intended for production use. I naively assumed Gary had provided them with the production configuration himself. The CTO narrowed her eyes, her gaze burning into Gary. Gary? He stood there as if static noise was buzzing where his heart should be. Yes, I was under the impression that the version was complete. On what basis are you making these claims? And there it was, the moment of truth, when abstract suspicion crystallizes into a deadly weapon. I leaned forward, anticipating my triumph. Would you like me to share my screen? I can pull up logs with clear timestamps proving that the AFC triggers are firing exactly as programmed when accessed through the legacy specifications. And immediately, Slack messages, emails, Gary's directives flashed on the screen, all the digital evidence, except for the smoking gun itself. Except for the part where I confessed to deliberately orchestrating this chaos. That's the art of sophisticated revenge: never confess, only skillfully guide events. By the time I finished my explanation, the CTO had turned pale, as if she'd just inhaled the scent of decay. I vividly imagined the scene: Gary, absent-mindedly flipping through important documents while half watching a motivational TED Talk. And this was the result, a $1 million system going down in flames because of his blatant incompetence. I believe we should suspend the offshore development implementation until everything is properly documented, she said, and in those words, you could clearly hear, someone will pay for this, and we'll pretend we don't know who. Gary tried to offer some kind of justification, began to mumble something about communication issues and an unfortunate oversight, but his voice cracked betrayingly, and no one rushed to his aid. He was drowning in the depths of his own failure. After the meeting, Phoebe messaged me again. This time, the message consisted of only 2 words, "You knew." I stared at the screen for a long time, typed a reply, deleted it, typed it again, and finally sent, "I warned him." There was no further response from her. 2 hours later, I was summoned to HR. Ashley Carter looked as if someone had applied turpentine to her face instead of war paint, such was her grimace. Looking back at the knowledge transfer process, she said, "Are you certain that the documentation you provided fully met the requirements?" I handed her a flash drive protected by a one-time key. "It's all there," I assured her, including a complete spec journal, both what they requested and what they didn't even know to ask for. Ashley Carter blinked, surprised. "Why 2 sets?" "Because," I stood, slinging my coat over my arm, "Gary insisted on an outdated build. Said the overseas team needed to start with the basics." I figured it was part of some elaborate compliance scheme. She opened her mouth, but I cut her off with my most charming smile, laced with just a hint of venom. "And, Ashley Carter, you should really dig into the Slack logs. Start with the phrase cut corners. See who used it first." I left without waiting for a response. I walked out slowly, but not far, because I had one final act remaining. The last note that would turn Gary's pathetic cost-cutting measure into a corporate nightmare. And that note was scheduled to sound in 36 hours. Tuesday, 3:47 a.m. The final piece of my diabolical plan set sail across the digital seas. I hadn't slept in what felt like forever. Curled up in my basement like a predatory spider at the center of its web, I watched the data stream pouring in from the mirror I'd surreptitiously tapped into the corporate network half a year ago. My digital scout, slipping through 3 proxy servers and an abandoned SAS integration everyone had forgotten about since 2020. They forgot I built that integration. But I remembered how to listen, and now it was singing its malevolent song. The AFC hydrocore triggers started locking up across all the manufacturing nodes, exactly as planned. And the best part? The error messages were vague, non-critical, not even warnings, just a quiet erosion of confidence. This wasn't an explosion, but a slow suffocation, subtle, relentless, and undetectable. By 8:10 a.m., the dashboard was ablaze with red from order processing delays. At 8:32, 2 leads from offshore development raised concerns about issues they naively attributed to time zone glitches. By 9 a.m., the monthly close for one of our Fortune 500 clients had cratered, creating 87 duplicate entries. And then, at 9:12 a.m., the call came from Gary. I let it ring twice, deliberately drawing out the pause. I answered. "Beatrice Bellwether," his voice croaked, as if it was being squeezed from his chest. "I need your help. Everything's falling apart." Oh, how I wanted to savor this moment. The rasp of desperation from a man suddenly realizing that the light at the end of the tunnel wasn't salvation, but an oncoming train. I should be burned at the stake, I thought. Coldly and dispassionately, I said, "I'm no longer an operations specialist, Gary. Remember? You demoted me. I'm just a trainer now." His voice cracked, as if struck. "I know, but it's really bad. The team is demoralized. They have questions about discrepancies in the documentation. About holes in the rollback conditions." I feigned confusion. "That's odd. I followed your instructions to the letter. You said, only the outdated specs. No mention of the hydrocore. Training, compliance first and foremost." He went silent. A long pause where I could physically feel him sinking into the quicksand of his own lies. Finally, he choked out, "I need access to your local archive." Deleted after launch, I snapped. You know best practices. Silence in response. He didn't even bother to hang up. He just left the line open, and the sound of a corporate empire in agony filled the space between us like static. By noon, the call came, and this time, it wasn't from HR. It was the CTO. Private room, no assistants, no coffee cart, just her, a closed door, and a binder the size of the Bible. She didn't mince words. I've reviewed the Slack messages, the Jira tickets, the deployment logs. She paused, her eyes boring into me. And I also read your email from 3 weeks ago about potential specification discrepancies from Gary. The one he buried under a filter. Ah, so it was noticed, I thought. Beatrice Bellwether, she said, folding her hands on the table, were you aware that the system you were training on was incompatible with our current environment? I met her gaze head-on, unflinching. I was aware that I was following the explicit directives I was given. All documented, time-stamped, and copied. I assumed leadership knew what they were doing. A pause. A heavy, oppressive silence. She didn't blink. Then, like a thunderclap, it came, effective immediately, Gary is suspended pending investigation. Boom. The first domino fell. As for you, she continued, her tone softening, I want you to take on a temporary role as a systems consultant. Help us stabilize the situation. Help us fix the bugs. And I gave her a smile. Not a wide, unrestrained one, but thin, like a blade glinting in the shadows. Of course, I said, my voice ready, but my heart far from sincere. Always happy to help. The game was just beginning. I had an ace up my sleeve, the unpublished build, the full version of the hydrocore fix, which I had nurtured alone while they were playing architects. And it wasn't for them, it was for me. When the dust settles, I'll not only get Gary's job. I will get his budget, his team, his corner office, and one last, crushing surprise planned for Friday morning, just before his name disappears from the corporate roster forever. Friday. The culmination of launch week. The air was thick with the smell of panic and expired ambitions. I dressed in black. Not for theatrics, but because it felt appropriate. As if I had arrived at a funeral, where I was simultaneously playing the gravedigger, the priest, and the man who sold the coffin at wholesale. Passing Gary's glass office, I noticed it was empty. No nameplate. Just a chair slightly turned, as if the owner had left it in a hurry, mid-sentence. By 9 in the morning, I was standing in the war room, feeling the looming silence. To my left, like a stone block, stood the CTO, to my right, a lawyer with an inscrutable face. Half the board of directors was watching us through a secure channel, their invisible presence no less oppressive than a real one. The goal was to get to the bottom of things, to conduct a final analysis of the causes of the disaster. I started with one slide, a summary of the damage mitigation work. Compliance with outdated specifications, the inscription read, and below it, like an exposed wound, were 7 points. All dry facts, with precise timestamps. None of them directly accused anyone, but every breadcrumb led straight to Gary's decisions, whose mouth, I'm sure, was now hanging open in horror. I even added a graph, neat and ruthless, entitled Correlation between Deployment Instructions and System Regression. The subtitle finished it off, What Happens When Brains Are Replaced by Budget Sheets? A dead silence fell in the room. Nobody laughed. Someone coughed, so loudly that it could be taken for sarcastic applause. And then, without warning, I unleashed the full weight of the truth on them. While studying the rollback protocols, I discovered an unmerged branch in our pre-hydro core environment, I said, clicking the remote to bring up the second slide. It appears to contain a working version of the AFC logic, fully debugged, with rollback security, load balancing, and cross-node synchronization. The CTO leaned forward sharply, a glimmer of hope mixed with the horror of realization in his eyes. You mean, we had a solution all this time? I bowed my head, saying quietly but firmly, the potential was enormous, but no one touched it. Beatrice Bellwether glanced at me, and a spark of hope flashed in her eyes. You were able to unlock it? A smile touched my lips. Quietly and imperceptibly. While everyone was asleep, I spent the night preparing. The room was silent, as if everyone was holding their breath. It was broken by the gray-haired financier, who had been silent until that moment. His voice, usually quiet, now sounded with undisguised amazement. "You mean the system has been stable since 3:17 a.m.? Exactly. Errors have been reduced by 98.7%. The rest is just minor noise." The room exhaled loudly. Nods followed, full of relief and recognition. The CTO, pulling me aside, said with pressure, "We need to officially solidify your role. What it's called now is just not enough. You're more than just a systems engineer, you're not even just a trainer." She paused for a moment, then, with a grin, added, "Let's just say, you're the reason the lights are still on." I nodded, feeling pride straightening my shoulders. I like the sound of that. But that wasn't the end of it. There was one last touch. The final spark. At 4:45 p.m., a letter arrived in the company's general mailbox. Subject: Words of gratitude from Beatrice Bellwether. His farewell letter was laconic, businesslike. Gratitude for the support during this difficult period of change, recognition of the merits of international colleagues, and, like a time bomb, a link to YouTube. The video was called simply and succinctly, "When Bosses Forget How Things Really Work." I tried to maintain anonymity, faces blurred in pixels, voices distorted, but every word, every phrase was pure truth. Decisions made from above gaped with their incompetence. Shots were Gary, smirking smugly, throws, "Why do we need these full specifications from Beatrice Bellwether? Let the new team figure it out somehow." Stuck in my memory like a splinter. The video, of course, didn't explode the internet, but it spread widely enough that every middle manager forwarded it with a snide comment like "Oops," or "Reminds anyone?" By Monday, there was no trace of Gary's LinkedIn profile, scorched earth. As early as Wednesday, 3 recruiters from our direct competitors inundated me with offers, promising to double my salary. But I stayed. You can't just burn down a house you put so much effort into. It needs to be rebuilt. And have your name added to the deed. The following Friday, I was already sitting in Gary's old office. The same creaky chair, the same view from the window, but the air was different. The air of freedom. His idiotic motivational posters had vanished as if they had never been there. In their place was a board covered in diagrams of work processes. My work processes. And oh, universe, how timely your intervention was. I was calmly sipping tea in the break room when I overheard them whispering. 2 junior analysts, like schoolgirls at lockers, were gossiping. "Did you hear, Beatrice Bellwether once trained a team of developers overseas?" "No way." "The Beatrice Bellwether?" "Yes. They say the whole system crashed due to incorrect specifications. She was forced to train them on outdated things, deliberately." "Do you think she did it on purpose?" "Have you ever seen anyone smile like that if they don't know what they're doing?" I slowly stirred my chamomile tea and, without saying a word, walked past. That's the beauty of a good story, you don't have to tell it. It tells itself. And Gary, I heard, is now consulting for some startup in Boise. Last week he sent me a friend request. I blocked him and published an article titled "How Not to Migrate a Legacy System, a Case Study." No names, of course. There was no need. Ashley Carter from HR quit 2 months later. And her successor now carefully examines contracts and Slack correspondence. The offshore team is still in place, but now they've learned a lesson. Before hitting execute, double-check the rules of the game twice, if not 3 times. And Phoebe, she reached out. Not for apologies, she didn't need them. Just dropped, "Next time you're up to something, I want to be in the real game." I sent her an invitation, of course. Because here's the truth of life that no one says out loud: sometimes you have to burn the barn to the ground to get rid of the rats. Sometimes the most flawless system grows out of the ashes. And sometimes the best promotion comes in the guise of someone else's arrogance. So no, I didn't just survive the sabotage. I was the architect of this chaos. And when the smoke cleared, I was left alone, with blueprints in hand, matches, and the keys to a new world. Welcome to the Beatrice Bellwether system. We have no more room for failure.